right? So when corporations say, well, we want to have, whatever it might be, an inclusive program where we will support our transgender employees, or where we have an advertisement on TV with an interracial couple, or whatever the far right says is too woke for society now, right? This is what American society actually is. This is what the majority of American society wants to see. And so when they say woke corporations, they're really just speaking from that 20 to 40% of America that sees all of it as some kind of woke conspiracy. And again, when they say woke, they've racialized a term. Woke was a term that came out of the Black community, and it was a positive thing. And they've, of course, as racists in the United States always do, transform it, weaponize it, and make it their own weapon against minorities, which is
and when you go to
practice.
You ask them to define it after the fact, they go, we don't know.
They don't know what they
but we hate it.
We hate it, right? Exactly. So
all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another exciting episode. Today we've got Eric Draitser, somebody who is the host at Counterpunch Radio. He has a podcast where he dives into imperialism and just everything political that's important right at the moment. How are you doing today, Eric?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on because your podcast is very eye-opening, and everybody who hasn't checked it out should check it out. But and I wanted to just start off by asking, what do you make of the Ukraine war? Obviously, there's many sides, and you've written some articles recently, also trying to make sense of the Ukraine war. In a nutshell, what are we looking at?
Very complicated conflict that's transformed the entire world. It's transformed our politics. It's transformed politics on the far right, on the far left, in the center. It is a watershed in recent history. It certainly is in regard to East-West relations between the United States and Russia. I mean, all of these things are probably self-evident. So in many regards, it's a turning point. That being said, I think that there are a number of ways of understanding the war, of characterizing it, because it's not simply one kind of war. It's actually multiple kinds of wars at the same time. And unfortunately, at least speaking on the left, as somebody who's on the left and who engages in the various debates and left discourse, I think there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about the nature of the war. Certainly a lot of misunderstanding about the last 30 years, what happened in 2014, how these forces interact with each other, meaning the forces of the United States, Europe, NATO, the European Union versus Russia, the various political projects and influence operations that Russia had in Ukraine, and these sort of conflicting interests sort of converging in Ukraine, and different types of wars that are playing out at the same time. So you see in many circles, people call it a proxy war between Russia and the US or NATO. You also see use of terms like inter-imperialist war, recognizing that this is also a war of imperial revanchism on Russia's side, while simultaneously a war to maintain, extend further U.S. Western hegemony, if you look at it from that context. And these, of course, converge, these you might call them opposing agendas, converge in Ukraine. At the same time, you also have to understand that these forces have collaborated over the last 30 years and worked together throughout this entire period. And so it's both a kind of culmination of a series of conflicts and also a transformation of what had been a collaborative project. And I point out in some of my writings, many of the reasons why a lot of the talking points on the left, from the what you might call the more pro-Russian orientation on the left, which talk about NATO expansion and Russia being on the defensive and Russia hitting back against the United States' ever encroaching presence on Russia's doorstep, et cetera. I mean, all of the sort of Mearshheimerian arguments that you've heard replayed many times over from left-wing circles to Tucker Carlson, right? But at the same time, what they leave out is, of course, the fact that Russia was collaborating with NATO for 20 years in Afghanistan, that Russia was the second leading arms supplier to the U.S. and Western forces in and Afghan forces in Afghanistan, that Russia provided NATO a military base inside of Russia for 15 years leading up to 2014, right? So this aspect of it gets suppressed in favor of a much more simplistic narrative. And that's literally only one of many facets of this war that is much more complicated than even what you might call the sort of superficial analyses that you get from a lot of sections, even on the left. And so, I don't know if you want me to just continue. I mean, I could go on, but I mean, I would just say that, yeah.
I will. I'll ask you. Traditionally, the right wing in America has been heavily invested into the military-industrial complex. But from what we're seeing from the media at this particular juncture, they don't. They want peace or whatever. They want to.
I would disagree with that. I would say they want to redirect. They want to redirect U.S. belligerence and U.S. aggression away from Ukraine and Russia and toward China. So, in fact, it's really not actually, in any sense of the word, a turning away from the military-industrial complex or away from U.S. imperialism or anything like that. It is merely a tactical division over how U.S. imperialism should be prosecuted around the world, and certainly what the primary enemy should be. That is what the actual divide is among, I wouldn't say left or right, I would say among what you might call the neoliberal consensus and the sort of neoconservative consensus, which is in some senses come together in a very strange way on the one hand, versus the sort of far right consensus, which is much more pro-Russian and sees Russia as, I guess, secondary to China. So anyway, in a sense, this is really what the divide is about, I would argue.
Just picking the right boogeyman is just a fight over the boogeyman. But they both are together in the sense that they are against socialism, both neoliberal and neocon. They're like, well, we can agree on one thing.
Yes. Well, anti-communism is sort of in the very DNA of the United States, and it runs very deep in both of the two capitalist parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Of course, the Republican Party is now being more or less overtaken by a fascist political formation inside of the Republican Party. And so many of the neoconservatives of the Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz war criminal variety have found many more allies among the right-wing Democrats of the Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton variety than they do even within their own party. So the transformation that I was talking about in terms of global politics is also in a sense reflected in U.S. domestic politics. And that transformation globally, we see the far right ascendant all over the world. I mean, we just had a fascist presidency in Brazil, which was ended by Lula's reelection. We had, of course, the rise of Donald Trump is an obvious example. But I mean, we have other smaller examples since then where the far right has been ascendant to a large degree because they've been positioned themselves as quote unquote anti-establishment at a time when the establishment is firmly discredited. And that, in fact, is what fascists always do. That is exactly how the fascists rose to power in the 1920s and 30s. So,
yeah. So, and what's to account? Obviously, we've been imperial swine for a long, long time, and we've been successfully subverting people's democracies. But in the case of like Evo Morales, they were able to prove that he was set up and a lot of things. Are we losing our hegemony? Or is there a turning of the tide that's noticeable? For me, when Iran and Saudi Arabia become friends and China and Russia become friends, it appears that the deck is kind of, our time is running out.
Yes and no. I think there is a desire among people who, like me, for instance, whose entire political life up until this point has been about opposing the United States. There's a desire to always see in every maneuver by Russia or by China or by whomever, here's more evidence of the decline of U.S. hegemony. And yes, it's true, of course, in the long run, the U.S. imperial power, in my view, has probably peaked. I think that's clear. I think it's clear that the United States is in decline. But at the same time, I'm very hesitant to sort of declare the death of U.S. hegemony because, of course, the United States still is by far the most vicious imperial monster on the planet. It still maintains a global military footprint that surpasses basically every other country combined. The United States is still able to exert tremendous power basically all over the world, even without firing a shot, as we see with the economic war it's waged against Russia in response to Russia's criminal war against Ukraine. The United States dominance in terms of global finance capital, financial flows. Remember, it's not just U.S. military power. U.S. banks control much of the global financial architecture. And despite Russia and China's, stated desires to move away from that and develop their own systems and this and that, most of the world ain't biting. Most of the world still is parking money in U.S. Treasury bonds, is still looking at Wall Street. Financial flows still flow through the heart of capital. And so, anyway, I say all of that because I think we should be, if we're being, something other than just cheerleaders for non-U.S. states, but actually serious analysts who are looking at this from a serious perspective, from a Marxist perspective, dare I say. And when you look at it in that sense, you're like, I don't know about that. I mean, the U.S. dollar is still very dominant. The U.S. economy is still light years ahead in terms of its actual financial power. It's not necessarily the total size only. It's also influence. And I mean, we could talk about Gramsci and in terms of U.S. cultural hegemony, but U.S. cultural hegemony is still extremely strong. And in some ways, it's gotten even stronger because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as we see Europe sort of re-embracing the United States and NATO as its protector, as it kind of reestablishes itself as a vassal of U.S. imperialism in response to sort of the dramatically shifted balance of forces in Europe. Not that long ago, just a few years ago, China was an ascendant power in Europe in terms of influence. The Germans and others were looking at China as potentially an alternative to reliance on the United States, reliance in terms of imports coming into Europe, I should say. And that's gone to a large extent. China has thrown a lot of that away itself by aligning itself so closely with Russia. And of course, Europe moving closer to the United States. So much has changed. And yet at the same time, things are only getting worse.
Yeah. And I can attest to the fact, because I'm in Germany and you see nothing but Ukrainian flags flying everywhere. And so there is a neoliberal, just hardcore, vibe to where I am. And they've doubled down on, and when it came to blowing up the pipeline, they just said, we don't know who it is. It's like, yeah, come on. But as far as the rise of fascism in America, I mean, historically, this has been attributed to, economic hardship, and it's also kind of backed by industrialists. What's to account, in your opinion, for the rise of fascism in America right now?
It's a lot of different elements. It's really, the U.S. is a very, I say this to my international friends as if they don't know, but just to reiterate, the U.S. is a massive, massive country and an extremely sort of, complicated society with a lot of countervailing forces. I don't think that what we see now in terms of economic downturns is anything like what we saw in the Depression. It's not even really like what we saw in the 1970s. I mean, inflation, yes, and in some ways, yes, but still the U.S. has managed to kind of sort of buoy itself economically enough to where I don't think economic downturn necessarily explains all of it. It does partially. Right. You see an embrace of far right politics from some people among younger groups. But generally speaking, you don't really see it like that. You see it more among, as you might imagine, from historical fascism. You see it embraced by the petty bourgeois. You see it embraced by the small business owner, by the petty bourgeois class, just as it was in Germany and especially as it was in Italy. And again, I think this has to do with a number of factors, some of them being cultural. The culture war is obviously something many people talk about, but I mean to say that we now have it driven in a way by social media, by data aggregation, and all of these other technological tools that have created, I think, sort of amplified version of what we've always had in the United States, a culture war that is happening amidst what I've already mentioned, which is an obvious period of decline for the United States, decline globally, but also decline in terms of general living standards. GDP doesn't really account for the transformation and the total evisceration of a middle class. right? The middle class is more or less disappearing. And I mean, I know that right wingers say that, other people say that, but it is true in a sense, right? If you're just a normal middle class worker, things are getting worse for you. Salary increases don't even keep up with the rate of inflation. The job market sucks. The real estate market sucks. You can't live. You can't attain the life that your parents had. Right, that normal middle class, home ownership, all of the rest of those things is much less attainable now. And because of that, naturally, people look for answers. Some people look for scapegoats. It's the Mexican rapists. It's the, whatever Donald Trump might say, versus the others who would, look at, wow, those dumb hicks voting for Republicans or whatever. Right. So it's a self-perpetuating kind of culture war, and Donald Trump managed to seize on that. At the same time, it is also connected to Russia. Russia is a major financier of the global far right, as we know has been documented with Marine Le Pen, as we know has been documented with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, with many other far right, Salvini in Italy, many others who are directly connected to the Russians. And the Russians use the far right for their own political project to create divides within the European, artifice, to be able to exploit those divisions. They do it in Germany, of course. Originally, it was with the Pegida movement, and of course, then it became the AfD. And they have similar, parallel kinds of operations in other countries in Europe as well. And so the Russians are very central to driving the far right, certainly Bolsonaro. And Trump, of course. I don't even want to get into 2016. That's a whole other series of issues that are misunderstood by almost everybody. But I will say that what the Russians have managed to do is to weaponize the far right against Europe itself and against the United States. And that's part of the reason why, if you watch Putin's speeches, every single one of his speeches talks about gender, transgender issues, traditional values, weaponization of culture war, Western culture war issues, which have now become global culture war issues. That's also feeds into a lot of this as well. So, I mean, I know that's not the most satisfying answer because there's like 100 other things that are driving a lot of this. And to clarify, I'm not suggesting that the rise of fascism internationally is entirely attributable to a Russian conspiracy. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that the Russians do fund some of that and do help to promote it and to drive it because it furthers their own interests. That's why we saw Alexander Dugin palling around with the Golden Dawn in Greece at the same time that his people were palling around with Syriza. So it's like you can play both sides, and the Russians do that. And the United States, by the way, also very much has done that historically, although the United States has been much more aligned with far right elements and fascist elements internationally than it ever has been with the international left. So.
Yeah. And behind it, you mentioned industrialists constantly behind the kind of the door of fascism and reaping the benefits. Is that going to continue to happen? Are we still going to, but there are some, woke corporations that are apparently staking their claim in the culture war. Are they just as guilty as the fascists by doing that?
Well, I wouldn't. Woke corporations is a right-wing term to basically say any corporation that makes any focused and decided attempt to appeal to the broadest mass of people.
Which is their job, yeah.
Right. So the broad mass of people in the United States do not subscribe to this anti-woke philosophy. That is the solid 20 to 40% of the country that is really far right, that sees everything as a woke conspiracy and whatever. But if you look at survey data, I just saw some polling data, I think it was like 2 days ago from I think it was Pew Research. I'd have to go back and find the link, but it was one of the major polling agencies. And I mean, it was looking at exactly this question and about wokeness and inclusivity and social equality and equity, and using these kinds of terms that are all demonized by the far right now in the United States, right? And the majority of the country, 55, 60, 65, sometimes 70% of the country is in favor of these things. Right. So when corporations say, well, we want to have, whatever it might be, an inclusive program where we will support our transgender employees, or where we have an advertisement on TV with an interracial couple, or whatever the far right says is too woke for society now, right? This is what American society actually is. This is what the majority of American society wants to see. And so when they say woke corporations, they're really just speaking from that 20 to 40% of America that sees all of it as some kind of woke conspiracy. And again, when they say woke, they've racialized a term. Woke was a term that came out of the Black community, and it was a positive thing. And they've, of course, as racists in the United States always do, transform it, weaponize it, and make it their own weapon against minorities, which is
when you go to
practice.
You ask them to define it after the fact, they go, "We don't know."
They don't know what
but we hate it.
We hate it, right? Exactly. So anyway, to your point, the idea of a woke corporation is itself ludicrous. But the point being, though, I think the broad thrust of your question has more to do with the divides among big capital when it comes to these political questions. And there are major divides, clearly. Donald Trump would never have been in power if he didn't have institutional power and backing from some segments of capital. I would say there are major divides. Major divides include things like dirty industries, polluting industries that are demonized by, the sort of liberal, neoliberal wing of capital now. I wouldn't even say demonized. Joe Biden just approved the most massive fucking drilling expansion in Alaska in history. So that's what are we really talking about?
That's what I'm confused about, is because they both seem to be about the same thing, but Trump will come out and say, "Oh, we want this good, clean coal," but at the same time, it's obvious that
Trump will come out and say, "We want to repeal California's laws limiting air pollution." And you're like, "What the fuck? Are you crazy?" But it's almost, I wouldn't even say ideological, because Trump himself doesn't really have an ideology. It's like pathological.
Money.
It's like it's money. Of course it is, but it's money for the Democrats too. But when the Democrats do it, they do it for policy reasons. They have to take a hit to do this, right? They attack their own base, and they always do. That's what Democrats do. Democrats attack the left, not the right. Their job is to police the left, to keep the left, the crazy socialists, from ever getting anywhere close to power. It's part of the reason why the Democratic Party united and combined to destroy Bernie. Not that I love Bernie. I'm a commie, obviously. I don't love Bernie. Bernie's just a progressive Democrat. But even still, I mean, the way that they united to smash Bernie and to prevent Bernie from rising and taking over the party, that tells you what the party's about, right? Democrats don't actually care about anything other than power, but their power rests in their ability to control those on their left, and simultaneously to collaborate with those on their right, which is what they've done. Well, the problem for them is, of course, now the far right has taken over the moderate right, which collaborates with the Democrats. And so now the Democrats are absolutely screwed. And what we see is, the ascendancy of a single party, basically.
But the right is obviously against, or doesn't have any incentive in the pharmaceutical industry, because they're railing against it so hard that they're going to turn their right base so anti-pharmaceuticals. Just the way that people are raving about the vaccine, and I would not totally agree with that. I would say it's a split on the right on that issue, because they wax poetic all day long about pharma, and then most of them ran and got their vaccines anyway. So ultimately, it's social media posturing and culture war superficial bullshit. It's not real. Most of the politics you see is performative. Right. Perform for the camera. They perform for the clicks. They perform for the views. They perform for their friends on Facebook or on TikTok or whatever it might be. Most politics is now performative politics. It's part of the reason why we're so inept when it comes to actual real world organizing. And part of the problem, of course, is, you can be skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, but it's not like everything the pharmaceutical industry does is bad. I still take fucking Tylenol if I've got some pain. I'll still take their medications that those same companies are producing, right? It's just that when we're talking about
certain issues that get weaponized, right? Vaccines or whatever, right? These things fold into other subcultures in this country, whether it's the conspiracy theory subculture, conspiracy ecosystem online. And even that, of course, has many subcultures of its own, from the QAnon types to the Alex Jones types to the whatever, many Lyndon LaRouche, whoever, right? You could point to 100 subcultures and subvariants of those subcultures, right? But ultimately, to me, capital is more or less united, more or less, in terms of how it views itself in relation to the rest of the world. That's part of the reason why the United States has played the Russians so badly in Ukraine, right? Putin, in my view, as I said, from day one of the invasion, Putin made one of the great world historic blunders, one of the dumbest decisions made in the last 500 years of any leader, up with Napoleon's invasion of Russia, Hitler's two-front war. You could point to a number of other examples of horrible decisions that have really devastated their own countries. And this is one of them. And it's very clear that Putin has not only made a historic blunder, but has played right into the hands of Western imperialism. Now he's mired in a quagmire in Ukraine, just like they always wanted. Now he's stuck with a disastrous war that he is responsible for. And he's also lost most of the most valuable human capital that Russia had. That's part of the reason why, I mean, I don't know how many Russian friends and Russian speakers you know. I mean, you're in Germany. They're everywhere in Germany. They're all over Europe. Tens of thousands of professionals, including some of the most highly educated, highly trained, fled the country, never to come back, unlikely to ever come back, right? That brain drain that Russia's had since the end of the Cold War has now accelerated and set the whole country back probably a generation or two, right? Of course, the Russians will never say this. They'll never admit this, but this is the truth. And when you hear the words of Western imperialists, whether it's the Secretary of Defense or Joe Biden himself or those who came before him, they know that Russia's played itself. No matter how much Russia blusters, no matter how many nuclear threats there are, and no matter how serious everyone takes it. And of course, everyone in the West is taking it very seriously because they know what could happen. But they also know behind closed doors, Putin fucked himself here. And we're going to make him bleed for it. And that's what they're doing. So,
well, quite a few people are coming to the aid of Ukraine in this, or I'm sorry, to Russia in this way. They're making friends with Russia, and there's a global kind of people are getting sick of American imperialism. People are constantly talking about the illegal war in Iraq. You have Iran making friends with Saudis. You have Iraqis making friends with the Iranians.
I don't see that. I don't see Iran making friends with Saudis. I see that as a pure move of convenience. Obviously, the Chinese benefit from the PR. But what do you think is going to happen when the right comes back into power in the United States? What are the Saudis after? Do you think the Saudis really care about normalization with Iran, or do you think the Saudis are interested in normalization with Israel? I say the latter. That's what they've been laying the groundwork for several years now. MBS is prepared to normalize with Israel. And the way that you normalize with Israel is by establishing all of this beforehand. They're not normalizing with Iran exactly. They're reestablishing diplomatic ties. That's good. I think we want to de-escalate in the region. I'm happy to see a country that's not the United States mediating something. But let's not overstate it. The United States could never have done this because the United States does not even have diplomatic relations with Iran. So the United States couldn't have brokered such a deal, right? So I think that reasonable international observers that I have read also point out the fact that this is important, but we shouldn't overstate it because at the same time that this is happening, remember, Syria is occupied by multiple countries. You have Turkey basically now prepared to make a deal with Assad to liquidate the Kurds who are backed by the United States, partially.
Right.
Okay. At the same time, the Israelis are looking around and normalizing with the UAE, looking potentially to normalize with the Saudis. Now, where do you think Israel stands in all of this? Israel has been bombing Syria relentlessly for a decade. the Russians have been there since 2015. Why? Oh, because the Russians and the Israelis coordinate in Syria. That's the whole point. That's the whole part of this game. Syria has to be understood to understand Ukraine. Erdogan and Putin made a deal in Syria after the Russians moved their forces in. That's why Erdogan and Putin were able to carve up the country. That's why Idlib is under the control of the non-Assad forces, while the Turks are prepared to move into the entirety of northern Syria. This can't happen without a deal with Putin. The Israelis have a deal with Putin. The Israelis are part of the U.S. system. All of this is in play. That's all I'm saying is that so Iran and Saudi Arabia is an auxiliary issue to the much larger issue of the reshuffling of the board in the Middle East.
So pretty much you're saying everything that we think we know is theatrics as far as what we read about.
Partially. I mean, partially. I'm not trying to say that Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablishing diplomatic ties that have been broken for 7 years is bad. It's not. It's good. I'm happy to see de-escalation.
Peace on earth. Yeah.
But I don't believe that we should be these like doe-eyed idiots who just like look at every little development on a day-to-day basis and be like, oh, great, U.S. imperialism's over. The Chinese are here. Things are going to be cool. Like, no, they're not. These motherfuckers from China and Turkey and the U.S. and Russia, they're all carving up these territories, and they're doing it in collaboration with their local partners, Saudis, UAE, etc.
So the snub that Joe Biden got when he got to go see MBS, that was probably theatrics.
No, I wouldn't say that's theatrics. I think MBS hates Biden. I think MBS loves Trump. He knows he can control Kushner. That's been the whole game the whole time. That's the, I don't know if you follow the debacle known as Live Golf, the Live Golf Tour, which is backed by the Saudis, but this professional golf tour, which is tries to undercut the PGA, the long established professional golf tour. This is backed by the Saudis. This is a Saudi project to funnel billions of dollars to Trump because multiple events are held at Trump's properties, Trump's golf properties, right? And they funnel this money to Trump. Why is it? What is it? It's an investment. MBS and the Saudis invest in Kushner. They invest in Trump, and Kushner and Trump turn around and deal with them because it makes them money. It gives them leverage, etc. Right? The point being, Biden during the campaign made because he had to make very explicitly anti-MBS comments. One, he was cornered on the Khashoggi issue, and two, he was cornered on the Yemen genocide, right? And both of those issues made Biden make very tough comments about the Saudis. Of course, turning it around a couple of years, there's a war in Ukraine and a global energy shortage, and he's trying to lick MBS's boots and trying to make nice with MBS, and MBS is like, fuck you, dude. You know? So, that's the actual politics there. I think MBS hates Biden genuinely. I think he is happy to embarrass Biden in any possible turn. At the same time, the idea that the Saudis are like out of the U.S. orbit is also ridiculous. Right? The Saudis made a massive, I think it was like a $200 billion, whatever it was, massive weapons manufacturing contract with the Chinese, right? To import Chinese weapons. And people are like, this is a game changer. And it's like, yeah, but do you also think that the Saudis could continue to exist without the United States? So again, it's like yes and no. Yes, there's more wiggle room and more room for, let's call it, independent action from these deeply reactionary feudal monarchies, right? At the same time, let's not pretend that the entire international system that the U.S. erected after World War II has all simultaneously collapsed. It hasn't. And many of those institutions have actually gotten much, much stronger, including NATO. NATO is 1,000% stronger today than it was 2 years ago or even a year ago, right? You had a massive increase of NATO's forces since Russia invaded, 1,000% increase of NATO boots at military installations, tenfold increase since the war. Finland into NATO, Sweden probably eventually into NATO. Disastrous miscalculation. And of course, for those of us that are anti-imperialist, anti-NATO, anti-war, like, fuck you, Putin. You just set us back 75 years.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's like militarize our police for us too. Why don't you? Jesus Christ.
Well, that's the point, is that that NATO was discredited to a large degree before this. Let's not forget 20 years in Afghanistan for NATO, debacle in Libya, absolute criminal war in Iraq. NATO was a part of that, right? NATO absolutely, I mean, I don't want to get into the controversy over the issues, but Kosovo, Serbia in the late 90s as well. There's obvious examples there too. So it's like NATO was at its lowest. There were people in Europe, even leaders in Europe, questioning the utility of NATO. How do we even need NATO anymore? Should we develop some kind of independent European force, as Macron had been saying, several years before the Ukraine invasion? And of course, now that's all out the window. All out the window. NATO is not only needed, NATO must be expanded, NATO must be supported, NATO must be infused with money, infused with new weapons, and on and on and on and on. Everything that we have fought against for generations has now been very quickly reversed thanks to Putin's blunder.
Yeah. Do you think that that's was there ever like a real threat that Russia was going to come invade the Western bloc of Europe?
I don't know what we call a real threat. I made a video 2 days before, not 2 days, but a week before Russia invaded Ukraine, saying Russia's not invading Ukraine. What, crazy? So like, I don't know. I have enough humility. I have enough humility to say that, like, okay, I was wrong on that, as were most of us.
Right.
Most of us who watch these issues, who talk about these issues, did not think that Russia would do this, because it seemed just on its face ludicrous, a disastrous blunder waiting to happen. And he did it, right? So I don't know. I mean, no, I don't think so. But then again, there was just a story that came out the other day about a leaked report, allegedly, from the Kremlin about their 10-year plan to destabilize Moldova. And we all know that the Transnistria region of Moldova has been occupied by Russian forces for 30 years. So it's not even remotely unrealistic that the Russians could pull it off. They absolutely could. And if I were in Moldova, I too would be nervous about that. Absolutely. So, it's like, I don't think so. I can't see that necessarily. Then again, there's also talk that, Russia and Belarus would ultimately firmly join together into basically one federated country, right? So, I mean, could Russia take over Belarus? Yes. 100%. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, these are countries with Cyrillic alphabets that are Eastern in the sense.
Well, yes. And I mean, yes and no. Again, this is part of the danger in the West, is such a lack of understanding of the history. I'm not saying you, I'm just meaning in general.
I'm an idiot. That's
no,
for sure.
I was not saying that. I'm saying people in general have a lack of understanding about the history of the region, to the point where they don't even know, like, the differences between the peoples, right? This region has not only been Russian. This was also part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a massive imperial force in the 18th century, that only into the 19th century does that get broken up. Poland gets permanently broken up and disappears from the map. That was, of course, one of the great central liberation struggles of the 19th century was the liberation struggle for Poland, right? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote at length about Polish independence, the Polish independence struggle. It was one of the central struggles for the left in Europe in the 19th century. And the reason it was ultimately broken. Well, I shouldn't say the reason. I mean, the reasons are complicated, but the point is, it ultimately breaks up into what we now understand to be these different regions. Western Ukraine is different from Eastern Ukraine, because Western Ukraine was Polish and Eastern Ukraine was Russian. So part of the lack of solid analysis is a lack of historical understanding of the differences of what happened in 1917, what happened when the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and ultimately proceeded to fight a war in Ukraine, to fight a war into Poland, to fight multiple wars against multiple invading armies, including then themselves turning around and invading other countries as they tried to spread the revolution. Part of that leads to the period of time where Ukrainian anarchists and Ukrainian communists fought together side by side with the Bolsheviks, then fought against the Bolsheviks. There's a lot of history in the languages. I mean, Ukrainian is not Russian. Ukrainians are not little Russians. That's an aspect of what Lenin famously called Great Russian chauvinism. Great Russian chauvinism, which is embedded in the Russian imperial mindset. And it is Russian imperialism and imperial revanchism that is at least one of the animating and driving forces for Putin. Right. And that's Alexander Dugin and some of the other theoreticians of Russian imperial revanchist thinking. Right. And part of that is the idea of reuniting all of these former Russian territories, like Ukraine, like Belarus, right. So, and again, Belarus, their language is not Russian. It's similar, but it's not the same. Right. Ukrainian is not Russian. Ukrainian culture is not Russian culture. But in the history of the Russian imperial dominance, it subsumed everything else. The Russian subsumes everything else. So my family comes from Ukraine, but when my father's side comes from Ukraine. My mother actually comes from Moscow, but my father's side of the family, when you would come to the United States, no, Russian and Ukrainian, you don't say Ukrainian. Oh yeah, I'm Russian. I'm from Russia. Right. Even though you're from Ukraine, right? These things, Russia subsumed everything else. And that's part of what colonialism and imperialism does, right? That's one of the ways that colonialism functions, erases place names, erases languages, right, erases cultures, right? And subsumes elements of them into its own. That's one of the defining characteristics of the United States, of U.S. history. The erasure of indigenous peoples, the erasure of, well, actually not just indigenous peoples, but even attempts to erase the culture of immigrants coming to the United States, criminalizing Chinese immigrants, criminalizing Irish at one point in the 19th century, criminalizing Jews in many ways. So anyway, I just say all of that to say that, understanding the imperial history of the region, understanding that there was a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century and the Russian Empire comes to dominate by the 19th century, and the Russian Empire fought a series of wars against the Ottomans, and that's how the Russians ended up in control of Crimea. Again, Crimea was where the Tatars were, and this goes back to the Khan's invasions of 5 centuries earlier. You know what I mean? So anyway, I don't want to go off too far just to say there's a whole history.
Imperialism is not just a product exclusively made in America. It's something that happens with any big empire.
Of course. And I mean, come on. How do you think a bunch of white Russians ended up on the Pacific Ocean?
Right.
You think they were just invited by the indigenous tribes? No, I mean, they fought and killed and slaughtered their way east and especially south. How do you think Kazakhstan becomes part of the Russian Empire? How do you think Uzbekistan? These are not Russians, and yet they are subsumed into the Russian Empire. And then, of course, after the revolution and eventually the establishment of the Soviet Union, some of the conquered peoples of the Russian Empire gain a level of national self-determination. Like I said, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, these places that formed their own Soviet socialist republics. And at the same time, many others, like the Bashkirs and the Buryats and others, were still confined within what became the Russian Federation, right? So the Russian Federation itself, people, again, in the West just often don't even understand. The Russian, quote unquote, Russian Federation is a multi-ethnic country. It is multi-ethnic. It is full of people who are not Russians. They are Buryats, they are Tuvans, they are whatever they are. They are not necessarily Russians. They all speak Russian because that's the lingua franca, that's the national language, and that's what imperialism does. But there's a reason why the Russian Empire was called the prison house of nations in the 19th century, why Lenin wrote whole books about the right of nations to self-determination, right? To erase the Russian chauvinist legacy and replace it with a internationalist, vision of equality. Now, of course, that goes sideways with Lenin's death and the rise of Stalin, who really reinfuses Russian chauvinism into a sort of Soviet context and really sets the whole project back, in my view, forever.
Forever. For until now, when you have 50-year-old boomers in America being like, didn't you hear about what Stalin did? It's like, we all know.
And then you have 20-year-old idiots who have like Stalin laser eye pictures, like Stalin's cool. And you're like, dude, go to a fucking gulag, bro. Like, seriously, you are an idiot. The lack of understanding about Stalin is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. If you know anything about the Russian Revolution, Stalin is an absolute villain, in my view, because Stalin kills off the revolutionaries. He literally kills them off. And it's not some like, Trotskyist conspiracy. Trotsky had his own problems, but Stalin actually kills off the left opposition. He kills off everybody up until 1937, up until the purging of Bukharin. And that's the final death knell of the revolution, in my view. Stalin killed them all. He literally killed them all in power struggle and ultimately killed the revolution, in my view. So, but that's a whole other conversation.
And authoritarianism is just always so tempting for when you're trying to run an empire. It just seems to be like the go-to.
It's one of the if you have a critical view, even though I'm very much pro-Lenin, it is one of the critical things that we have to think about with regard to the Bolsheviks is like, did the organization of the Bolsheviks with its, very rigid hierarchy and extreme discipline, did that sort of breed Stalin's rise? You know what I mean? Did it almost lead to that conclusion, necessarily lead to that conclusion? I don't know the answer to that. There could have potentially been other ways of organizing the revolution. There potentially could have been other ways of organizing the party. I happen to think Lenin was mostly correct, but I also happen to think it's valid to say that Lenin left an apparatus that Stalin was very easily able to pick up and turn into an instrument of terror. Yeah. He did.
And he also had this great guy Lyshenko, who grew the crops all wrong, and ended up it was like, and then when the guy went to China and taught the people how to do it there too. He's like, I got this great way to grow food. Check this out.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is too, without going too deep into the weeds about Lyshenko and all that, but like I would just say that the whole. One of the reasons why I don't really speak too much about Holodomor, to Ukrainian audiences is because I don't really buy into the idea that even though I think Stalin is an absolute historic villain, one of the great villains in history, actually, I don't think that Stalin deliberately starved Ukrainians. I think that Stalin's inept leadership and poor decision making and complete disregard for Ukraine and Ukrainian peasants especially, led to decisions to prioritize, shipments of food out of the country to create cash flow rather than allowing people to eat and survive, and things like that are really awful decisions. But I don't believe that it necessarily means that Stalin wanted to genocide Ukraine, because if that were true, then Ukraine would have a death toll in 1931 and 1932 well in excess of other regions. And that's just not what the data shows. The data actually shows similar death tolls in Kazakhstan at the same time. So it was truly famine based on a series of factors, including crop failure, actually two consecutive growing seasons of bad crop failures, bad weather, and also economic mismanagement and poor decision making and other factors that all kind of combined to create that disaster. And it's not to minimize even slightly the suffering of Holodomor and all of the rest of that. But I do in no way defend Stalin, but I do defend historical accuracy to say that I don't think Stalin tried to liquidate all of Ukraine using starvation as the weapon. I just think that that's just what they did.
The United States used that as an exaggeration to just drive it home that, hey, communism doesn't work, and this is why.
Ukrainians actually, really, because a lot of the anti-communist Ukrainians come to the United States and they establish like the Ukrainian Society in New York and other places, and many of them were influential in establishing some of these narratives. And yes, of course, the United States States uses this as part of its anti-communist propaganda, etc. But, Holodomor, for example, was one of those things that, really permanently imprinted itself into the Ukrainian diaspora's memory for obvious reasons. And, much like the Holocaust for Jews, it's the kind of thing that gets passed down to your grandchildren, and you tell them about what you suffered through or what your mother and father suffered through or whatever. And it becomes sort of an animating idea. And when your country, in the context of Ukraine, when your country is then invaded by its historic colonial overlord, you are then kind of scrambling for a kind of national unity. And some of that comes in a sort of collective remembrance of suffering, right? That's very much true of all societies. And Ukraine is really an interesting thing. Well, I just want to say one interesting thing about Ukraine, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that Ukraine was really denied nationhood. Ukraine never had nationhood because there was no Ukrainian nation, as I already said, certainly not in the 18th and 19th centuries, when different parts of Ukraine belonged to different empires. And I said Polish-Lithuanian. I didn't even mention the Habsburgs, what becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire that leading up into World War I, the west of Ukraine, which had been part of Poland by the 19th century. This is controlled by, Vienna, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So anyway, I don't want to go too deep into that. My point is just to say that, I lost
Ukraine has never had a nation state.
Yo, thank you. Yes, Ukraine has never really had a nation because it was sort of carved up among these different empires. And then a very brief period where Ukraine was going through kind of a process of nation building, while at the same time there was a power struggle in Ukraine over whether or not to sort of fully embrace the Bolshevik revolution. And of course, within a couple of years, that question is answered. Ukraine is eventually incorporated into the Soviet Union as an independent Soviet Socialist Republic. So again, and Stalin actually argued for Ukraine to have its own seat at the United Nations, but that was more to try to give him an extra vote than it was, about Ukrainian nationhood. But Ukraine never actually had nationhood, right? And so only in 1991 does Ukraine ultimately really become an independent nation. But by this point, after several centuries, you have a situation where, it's a country recognized on the map with international borders, but they don't have a common language. They don't have a common religion. They don't have a common history necessarily. Right? The west of Ukraine and the east of Ukraine are vastly different, speak different languages, belong to different churches. The Eastern Orthodox, west is the Catholic Church in Rome. So again, you have these major divides in Ukraine such that you never had a process of nation building. And you really have had these conflicts brewing ever since 1991 and definitely since 2014. So now into 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, and now you have the event that really, I think, touches off what you might call a process of nation building as a concept. See, I'm an internationalist and I'm a commie, so I'm against nationalism, right? I'm not suggesting that nationalism is some kind of positive force in all ways. It isn't. In fact, nationalism is almost always a negative force, reactionary to its core. But I mean to say that what's happened in Ukraine is that Russia's invasion united the country in a way that it had never been united before, even after 2014. The country had been divided. And now, to a large degree, it's been united in common opposition to a common enemy, right? Of course, with the Russians evacuate and things return to peacetime, all of the conflicts come back to a large degree. But this is, like, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, it was a turning point globally. This was a permanent turning point in Ukraine. Ukraine is now a country. People feel like Ukrainians. They don't feel like Jews who live in Ukraine. They feel like Ukrainians. They don't think of themselves as, kind of sort of Ukrainian, but kind of sort of Russian and whatever. No, they're Ukrainian now. That's what wars often do. They have a way of uniting people who have been invaded. unite. It's just a natural way.
Awakening their own personality about who they are as a nation. Yeah.
Yeah. And awakening a lot of conflicts too. There are a lot of conflicts. My family are Jews. They died in pogroms carried out by Ukrainians, Ukrainian nationalists. Ukrainians attacked Jews throughout history. So did everybody else in Europe, for that matter. Pogroms are, an inextricable part of Jewish history in the Pale of Settlement, and it happened all over, and it was almost always Jews who got targeted, oftentimes in the context of Ukraine, by right-wing Ukrainians. So including their own neighbors oftentimes. And by neighbors, I mean neighboring towns and whatnot. I mean, Jews tended to live in their own enclaves,
right.
In any event, yes. So my family comes from Odessa. When my father's, in the Soviet Union, my father's identification cards, so like, I guess the equivalent of like a combination passport and driver's license. They had identification papers, and it said on there, one of the boxes on those identification papers was called nationality. What is your nationality? Yes, you're a Soviet citizen. You're a citizen of the Soviet Union, but what is your nationality? And his nationality was Jew. Okay, not Russian, not Ukrainian, Jew. Ukrainians were Ukrainians. Jews were Jews.
Good.
Right? So the concept of nation and nationality itself was sort of in question in Ukraine. And that is also one of the other processes that's going on right now, among many, many others. So to get back to what I said at the very beginning, it's many conflicts at the same time. And they're not just all military conflicts. There are political conflicts ongoing in Ukraine. There are economic struggles ongoing in Ukraine. Zelensky's put forward and passed and signed multiple extremely anti-labor laws that are very neoliberal in orientation, that are vehemently opposed by trade unions, both in Ukraine, but also in Europe. But it's also wartime. So it's not so easy to just oppose the president, right? So there's a political struggle going on in Ukraine. There's a political struggle going on over Ukraine. There's an economic struggle going on in Ukraine, one between what is now the independent power base of President Zelensky, and the other being the various oligarchs who for the last 30 years controlled the economy. And that's a major sense of the terrain of struggle going on in Ukraine. Part of the reason being those oligarchs' control over the economy is one of the major stumbling blocks for Ukraine on its way into the European Union. European Union doesn't want to allow a country whose economy is controlled by 4 corrupt oligarchs into the EU. Right. So there's a process of conflict in Ukraine between Zelensky and oligarchs, between the oligarchs themselves, over how they align in relation to Zelensky now, in relation to the government, et cetera. So,
well, the oligarchy is even worse than communism from the neoliberal perspective, because, there's
the communists are the oligarchs. That's also part of the issue.
Right.
Is that, and this is another aspect of the situation in Ukraine that is just completely not understood by most people, is that much of the politics in Ukraine was a function of the various oligarchic interests. In other words, the various political parties were essentially controlled by competing oligarchs, including oligarchs in Russia and those that were aligned with Russia. The Yanukovych government was, which was the one that was overthrown in the Maidan in 2014. The Yanukovych government was backed by the Russians, but it wasn't just backed by the Russians. It was a political machine called the Party of Regions that was controlled by President Yanukovych. The Party of Regions combined with the former Communist Party in the eastern part of Ukraine, and the whole operation was managed by the Kremlin. So you had multiple major political parties inside of Ukraine that were quite literally vying for power and had won the presidency multiple times, that were quite literally controlled by Russia.
Isn't this the same story with what Belarus is now, or with Lithuania is now? One of these countries up there also is just basically a puppet of the Kremlin.
Belarus is directly a puppet of the Kremlin, and there was a time in the last decade when Lukashenko and Putin were not on the same page. But you have to remember that in 2020 there was a massive uprising in Belarus, major protests against Lukashenko. Lukashenko's regime was teetering on the brink of absolute collapse, and the only reason it survived was because of the Russians. the Russians sent in Russian intelligence and Russian advisors. And pretty soon, massive force was deployed on the streets, and everybody was rounded up and disappeared into prisons or fled the country. So now all of the leaders of the protest movement are now in Lithuania or Germany or elsewhere, living in exile because Lukashenko has jailed and killed pretty much all of them. All the ones who didn't flee. So because the Russians bailed out Lukashenko has to kiss the ring. Yeah. And this is how he kisses the ring. But you have to remember, it wasn't just Belarus. 1 month before the Russians invaded Ukraine, the Russians invaded Kazakhstan. Completely forgotten by almost everybody.
Never even heard of that. Never
There was a worker uprising in Kazakhstan in late 2021 and early 2022. This is the first major uprising in Kazakhstan since the previous worker uprising, which had been a number of years earlier. I want to say 2011-ish, maybe a little later. But anyway, and these are basically, these are oil workers and other low income workers who are just living in grinding poverty, absolutely brutal existence, who were, out there on the streets demanding, fuel subsidies and other like economic concerns that quickly became about their frustrations at this absolutely kleptocratic, corrupt government that runs their country and had run their country ever since the end of the Soviet Union. President Nazarbayev was basically the dictator in Kazakhstan since the end of the Soviet Union. He was still in power at this point. He then kind of sort of moves off to the side because I think he's 90 or whatever he is. And this other guy, Tokayev, takes over, but it's basically the same regime, right? So protests emerge. The protests get louder and louder and louder. And what happens? The Kazakhstan government picks up the phone and they call the Kremlin. The Kremlin sends in the special forces and the uprising is crushed. This is 6 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not like Russia just invaded Ukraine because NATO spent 30 years expanding. Russia invaded Ukraine because Russia has its interests. Russia does what Russia does. Russia sees its own agenda. It sees an agenda in propping up every single reactionary government in the former Soviet space because it can control them. And it's very worried about those governments that might emerge that it can't control. And one of the things it can't control is things like worker uprising in Kazakhstan. So you have to crush it. Right. So anyway, so Russia in many ways has become kind of this brutal enforcer of a right wing reactionary kind of politics, which is weird. It's weird for those of us who have spent our whole lives talking about how the United States is like this brutal enforcer of its own imperial sphere of influence and so forth. And yet now we have this. So then the broader question becomes, what is this? What are we living through, right? And the buzzword, the word that the Russians and others like to throw around all the time, multipolarity. Okay, multipolarity, the multipolar world. But ask yourself, when you look around the world and you look at the news every single day, ask yourself what multipolar means. Multipolar in practice, under capitalism, actually means simply a multipolarity of imperialisms. It just means more imperialisms. More and varied imperialisms. And one of the things that we see is this conflict in Ukraine as a kind of inter-imperial conflict. Now, that shouldn't mean, if you've been listening to me this whole time we've been talking, that doesn't mean to say that, Russia and the United States are equal in power. They're of course not equal in power, but two imperial powers don't have to be equal in power to be in conflict with each other. Right. And that's what we see. That's what's playing out. So anyway, to kind of wrap it up, the war is many different things at the same time. And you have to have a serious analysis of all of the different aspects of it to really even begin to understand what's happening.
There you go. My dude, Eric Draitser, he's dropping knowledge on the people at large. I'm gonna have you back because I have so many questions for you. There's not enough time in the day. But I want to thank you for coming. We'll talk after this. I will sign off to everybody. Check him out at Counterpunch. Great podcast. You'll learn a lot. You could also go to counterpunch.org and see the articles that he's writing constantly, putting out excellent, excellent content. Is there anything you want to add before we go?
Thank you for all of that. And the only other thing is that Counterpunch is where you can find my podcast. That podcast is an interview podcast. So I bring guests on and we talk about whatever is relevant to that guest. I also do YouTube like videos where I'm talking about, commentary and stuff like I've done here. And you can find that on my YouTube channel, but you can also go to Patreon where you can find exclusive content that's just for my supporters. And that is patreon.com/Eric Draitser.
There you go. The man himself. I can only recommend this man so much. You'll learn a lot. Check it out. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.